Hi, my fourth grade friends. Today we're going to do a little bit of practice on our note taking. So I want to remind you that great note takers consider the structure of a text when they're deciding how to take notes. Okay? Now, before we talk about the article that you read, let's go back to review what those structures are. So we have main idea and supporting details. Sometimes we have compare and contrast structure when we're comparing two or more things. We might also come across a problem and solution structure where they outline the problems and then the solutions. We might also have cause and effect. So if something happens, then something else happens. And last but not least, we might come across chronological or sequential structure. So we might think of it in order of time on a timeline or in order of events in a list. Okay. Now today you read an article from Studies Weekly called Colonial Unrest on the Uprise. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to read the last section together with you before we practice taking some notes. Colonial unrest. Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This placed a tax on any molasses the colonies did not receive from England. Now the colonists were angry. Some began to say, "No taxation without representation." Then, in 1765, Parliament passed another tax called the Stamp Act. This forced all colonists to buy a special stamp to put on legal papers. Even playing cards were taxed. The colonists were angry. Newspapers carried protests, and broadsides, papers posted on trees, carried messages of anger. The colonies soon could see they could make a stronger protest together than they could separately. In the fall of 1765, the colonies united in what was called the Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies sent representatives to meet in New York City. The Congress expressed anger about the Stamp Act. They ruled that Americans would not be taxed without permission. Throughout the colonies, men formed groups called the Sons of Liberty. Women formed groups called the Daughters of Liberty. These groups became the strength behind the colonial movement toward independence. Wow, some really important events happened in that section of that article. I'm wondering, how might I take notes on this? Well, I did hear that in the beginning of the article, first they talked about the Sugar Act and how that made the colonists mad. Then they talked about the Stamp Act and how that made the colonists even more mad, which caused them to protest. Are you getting the feeling that maybe we could take notes with a chronological structure? That maybe we could create a timeline or a list of events in order? That's what I was thinking. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to reread my article, and I'm going to try to take notes in order because all of the events that they were mentioning seem to be really important to the history of this American Revolution. All right, so here I go. I'm going to reread, and I'm going to take notes as I go. Now, it is, if I'm taking notes in chronological order or in sequence, I might want to make a timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. Let me reread. Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This placed a tax on any molasses the colonies did not receive from England. Now the colonists were angry. All right, so on my first part of my timeline, I'm going to go ahead and record the Sugar Act. Now, because these are my notes and I want them to be helpful to me later, I need to say a little bit more than just the name. So the Sugar Act was a tax on molasses. And that made the colonists angry. Great. Let's read on. Some began to say, no taxation without representation. Then, in 1765, Parliament passed another tax called the Stamp Act. When they used that word then and then gave a date, that tells me that we're talking about an event that happened. I am going to go ahead and put this event on this next door to the Sugar Act, but I'm going to use the space below. Okay, so again, that was called the Stamp Act. Okay, let me read a little bit so I can give a description of what the Stamp Act was. This forced all colonists to buy a special stamp to put on legal papers. Even playing cards were taxed. Wow, so like everything. The colonists were angry. All right, so the Stamp Act forced colonists to buy a special stamp to put on everything. And now the colonists are more angry. More angry. Okay. Reading on. The colonists were angry. Newspapers carried protests, and broadsides, papers posted on trees, carried messages of anger. The colonies soon could see that they could make a stronger protest together than they could separately. In the fall of 1765, the colonies united in what was called the Stamp Act Congress. So again, I heard a really important date, and those transition words where it says in the fall of 1765. That's telling me something else important that happened. I'm going to add that to my timeline. This time I'm going to go up so I have more room. So this is the fall of 1765. I'm going to put it up here so that way I have space to write. So the fall of 1765. They created the Stamp Act Congress. Now, what was that, right? I don't want to just put the title. I want to put a little bit of information so that way this helps me later on when I'm trying to teach someone else about this time. Colonies united in what was called the Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies sent representatives to meet in New York City. Oh, okay, so each of these 9 colonies sent a person to go represent them. The Congress expressed anger about the Stamp Act. Okay, so these 9 colonies sent someone to talk and to say how they were feeling about the Stamp Act. All right, let's put that on. So 9 colonies met to discuss the Stamp Act. And their feelings about it. Right? Now remember, these are notes, so I can do things that are helpful to me to remember what the important information is here. So I don't have to write everything, and I don't have to write in complete sentences, but I want to make sure I hit all the important details. Now, there was one more part that I think I should add to this piece of notes that I have here. So the 9 colonies sent their representatives to meet in New York City. The Congress expressed anger about the Stamp Act. They ruled that Americans would not be taxed without permission. And that actually kind of brings me back to the beginning of the article where it said, no taxation without representation. I'm going to add that quote to my notes because it is a very important one. So I just want to point out that because I had an idea of the structure of my text, because I read it first and I tried to think about what made the most sense, that helped me when I was going to make my notes. Now, I know a lot of us are doing our notes digitally on the computer, and it can be really hard to create a timeline digitally. So I also want to just show you how I did this not on a timeline before this video. These same notes right here, I also wrote as like a list format. So each of the events in order, I put on my list, on my notes, and then I said what that was, and I added a little bit of detail. So if you're struggling to do something like a timeline when you're working digitally on the computer on a Google Doc, you can still record those same events in order on a list. Okay? All right, I hope that was really helpful. So I want to remind you when you're reading this article and all your other articles or all your other texts, that great note takers consider the structure when they're deciding how to take their notes. Talk soon, 4th graders.